Your tweet, Jack, said based on the first 21 minutes alone, it was the worst performance I've ever seen from Tottenham.
It was the worst performance I've seen from any team at any level, I think. I don't think I've ever seen a team play that badly as Spurs did in that sort of 21-minute period in which they conceded 5 goals. It reminded me a little bit of Brazil losing the World Cup semi-final to Germany 7-1, in the sense that it felt really kind of weirdly transgressive to see a team just collapse like that. Like they didn't even in that Brazil game, though, I think they managed to get to half time pretty stable. Or at least they managed to survive for 20 or 30 minutes. Whereas here, Tottenham just almost literally didn't show up. I've never seen it was so easy for Newcastle to score. Like the cliche is always they look like scoring from every attack, but Newcastle did score from every attack. And it was only it wouldn't have felt at all surprising or weird if they'd gone on to rack up double figures. A small part of me disappointed they didn't do, because that would have been, I thought, like a fair judgment on how awful Tottenham were.
Your article, Jack, or you did a piece saying 4 years of bad decisions. So does that go back to November 2019 and Pochettino going
No,
and Mourinho coming in? Or where do we start?
I think I kind of let Daniel Levy off the hook there a bit. I think really, I mean, look, you can go back as long as you want. For me, it goes back to failing to back Pochettino in about 2017-18-ish, by which I mean failing to get rid of the players he wanted to get rid of and replace them with new players who actually wanted to be there, but which in turn led to the Pochettino era going completely stale to the point that Pochettino couldn't fix it, doing the recruitment in 2019 that they should have done in 2018 or before, then sacking Pochettino to get Mourinho, then sacking Mourinho just before the League Cup final, then bringing in Nuno, then trying to bring in Conte and hoping it would be like a better version of Mourinho, but without giving him the tools to do the job. So really it's been, and I'm sure there's some other things that I've forgotten about, Paratici, Super League, failing to do the kind of proper squad refresh that they needed until it was far, far too late. So look, it's about 4 or 5 years, give or take, of bad football decisions brings you to days like this.
Because I always, and maybe we'll go back to the start of that answer in a minute with Jack, Tim, but I always think the Daniel Levy stuff for non-Tottenham fans, I always think is very interesting, because they'll go, well, hang on a minute, money has been spent on players who have come in, and they do have the new stadium, and he has given them, Mourinho and Conte, who have been winners. Now, people have their own views on those two managers, but it's not as if they're Everton, with all due respect to Everton, who have watched their club slide completely under their ownership, and they have been in the Champions League. And this is what I'm saying from non-Tottenham fans, I think, look at it with a slight perplexion.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's obviously a lot of good things that have happened at Spurs, in the last few years, and that off-field stuff is really important. The stadium, the training ground, there'll be record revenues this year. That's how you want your club to be run, really. I think there's just immense frustration that they got themselves to this fantastic position, on the cusp of sort of joining English football's elite, and around the time they reached Champions League final 2019. And then there have just been a series of questionable or bad decisions since then, and I guess they've regressed. And they've needed someone to take them to that next level, and Levy's been unable to put the people in place to do that. And then it's such a mess this season, with Conte and then Paratici as well, and no trophy since 2008. And there's a lot of underlying frustration there, which Jack has spoken and written about. Going back a decade or two, really, and also, Mark, it's been a terrible year. I mean, they're fifth in the league, but they're not fifth. I mean, they're just not. Like they weren't fourth. They weren't the fourth best team in the country. They've been lucky that Liverpool and Chelsea have had such sort of poor seasons, and Harry Kane's really dug them out of trouble this season. I was looking at the numbers the other day as to how many points he's earned, how many points his goals have earned them. And I know you can do this with a few players, but I do think it's really relevant with Spurs, because if you took his goals out, they'd be 22 points worse off. So they'll be down on 31, which is below Bournemouth. So, and it has felt like that watching them, that Kane is literally the reason that they are where they are. So it's been a very bad year, and like I said, a lot of those underlying issues they've had for quite a few years now have really come to the fore in the eyes of the fans this year, who are paying £1,000 for a season ticket. Let's be honest.
You go back to the Pochettino era, Jack, and towards the end of that, and Champions League final, and so on and so forth. I can remember asking the question back then, given where Chelsea were and where Arsenal were, and given the hope that Tottenham had, that if you were a player and wanting to move to London and a London club, Tottenham felt like the most attractive proposition, really. But given the stadium and given the hope. So why didn't they capitalise on where they were at that stage? Why weren't they better in the transfer market, either moving players on or bringing players in?
Well, I think there's two reasons. One is that they had a lot of resources focused on the stadium. We can't forget this. They built a £1.2 billion stadium, and nobody handed it to them. This wasn't like Manchester City. It's not West Ham United. Tottenham had to build that stadium themselves with their own money, or money which financed from Bank of America. So that was not an easy thing to do. So they couldn't just go and spend as much as they have spent in the last 4 years. The other point is that I think Pochettino's vision was basically a little bit like Simeone's Atletico Madrid, in the sense that you want a hungry squad of ambitious players, and you do that with turnover, as in you do that with selling players when they're not hungry anymore and replacing them with new guys that are. That was Pochettino's vision. The problem was that wasn't really Daniel Levy's vision, because Daniel Levy doesn't really want Tottenham to be a selling club, and he's only happy to sell players if he's going to get a kind of really standout, brilliant price for them. For example, selling Gareth Bale to Real Madrid, he was happy to do. Selling Kyle Walker to Manchester City, he was just about happy to do. But he didn't want to be in the habit of getting good players and getting rid of them because the manager says, I think his head's gone. So that was where you first get the kind of disalignment between Pochettino and Levy. And if they'd followed the Pochettino model and sold Danny Rose to Chelsea, sold Dele Alli long before anybody else realised that he was finished, sold Toby Alderweireld to Manchester United in 2018, which I'm sure Pochettino wanted to do, sold Vertonghen if they had to, sold Lucas. Like, there were so many players that they could have sold. They didn't sell. If they had sold them, they could have replaced them with the sort of players that Pochettino wanted. And if they'd done that, then they could have maintained the hunger. The problem is, because they didn't do that kind of squad turnover, that churn of players, they were left with a bored, tired, old, stale squad, which is what happened by the end of the Pochettino era. So I think that's really where it started to fall apart.
And there's the problem, isn't it, within modern day football, Adam? If the chairman and the manager are with differing opinions and different philosophies, and at that stage probably didn't have a sporting director, did they, Jack? Back then, to sort of
not a sort of Paratici level figure.
No, and you don't have a sporting director to sort of be the what's the word I'm looking for? The conduit between the two.
Yeah, but then we're also told quite often, aren't we, that Pochettino doesn't love having a sporting director as well.
He likes having a sporting director as long as the sporting director is basically accountable to him. Right. What I don't think he likes quite so much is having to be accountable to a sporting director, which makes me wonder, what's he going to make of Chelsea's sporting director model? It's like, Mauricio, you're walking into you're going to have to be accountable to 3 different sporting directors here. It's going to be. If you thought one was bad enough.
Yeah, I mean, there is a nightmare scenario for Spurs coming this week, isn't there? If Chelsea do Pochettino this week, which doesn't sound impossible the way conversations seem to be going, if they were to announce that 2 p.m. on Thursday, a few hours before Tottenham play Manchester United at home on Thursday evening, I mean, how toxic, if Spurs were to go a goal or 2 down in that game, do you think that stadium becomes?
Unlike it's ever been before, a new level of toxicity. People have seen this coming from miles out. Like, I can't believe that. Maybe I'm just speculating here. Maybe Daniel Levy will put in a phone call this week because he wants to make it look as if he has tried. But if Pochettino's been kind of sat at home for the last year since PSG sacked him. Daniel Levy has had so much time to put in the phone call to Mauricio Pochettino, and he's decided not to do it. And if Pochettino, I don't think Pochettino can be. I don't think Spurs fans will be happy with Pochettino if he goes to Chelsea. But I don't think they can blame him either, because they can't expect him to not work and sit by the phone waiting for Tottenham to call forever. And so if he does end up as Chelsea manager, then Daniel Levy is going to, like, the pressure and anger directed from the Spurs fans towards Daniel Levy will be on another level from what it is already.
I mean, you've written about this, haven't you, Tim? I mean, Jack's point is right. Pochettino can't sit at home twiddling his thumbs thinking, well, I won't take Chelsea because Spurs is available and at some point they might call.
No, exactly. And you know, that pressure of the situation is absolutely right. I mean, they've been singing Pochettino's name in the stands recently at Spurs. You know, that's how highly some of them still think of him. And it is interesting, the sort of dynamic between Spurs and Chelsea. Yeah, that's the article I wrote that you referenced there, Mark, in terms of them both needing a manager and both sort of shopping in the same pool of managers at the moment, potentially, and how they've intertwined before with Spurs taking 4 former Chelsea managers. And, you know, they've long admired Graham Potter, but you can't imagine for a second that they'll go for, you know, a manager who's failed at Chelsea, seeing as they've had ones that have won the league at Chelsea before and who haven't delivered for them. I guess it feels big for both clubs, really, you know, particularly with the state of the top 6 sort of situation at the moment, and, you know, the rise of Newcastle sort of disrupting that. You've got Villa on this, you know, trajectory under Unai Emery. You've got Brighton. You've got clubs with ambitions to break into that top 6. You know, if Chelsea get it wrong, it could be sort of financially disastrous for them. But if Spurs get it wrong, you know, they could be playing catch up for a few years here.
Have Spurs spoken to anybody yet, Tim? I mean, what we've heard all the way through on Chelsea, and this is the shortlist, and this is who they've spoken to, and this is who they're now ruling out, and this is who they weren't impressed with.
That'd be one for Jack, Mark, I'd say.
Right, Jack, have they spoken to anyone?
They're making slow and steady progress. They've got a shortlist, which I think is more like a long list. They obviously, I mean, Spurs have been saying that the process has been continuing while Paratici had this legal case hanging over him. Obviously, he's now out of the picture. They were hoping that he would kind of be able to jump straight back into the cockpit to oversee the next stages, which I'm sure will be the interview process. In terms of the likelihood from here, well, I think there's a big question mark over is Julian Nagelsmann now more interested now that he's out of the running for Chelsea? If putting that to one side, I'd say you're looking at Luis Enrique, Arne Slot, Vincent Kompany, maybe Ange Postecoglou, maybe Thomas Frank or Roberto De Zerbi. I think possibly Brendan Rodgers is a kind of wild card candidate, although I think there's some issues there. So I think that I reckon those will be the names under consideration. But Tottenham have known that Conte was not going to stay since Christmas, pretty much. So they've had about a 4-month head start on Chelsea, and yet Chelsea, who only sat Potter 2 weeks ago, have been able to move fast and fishing in precisely the same waters as Tottenham. You know, there's an almost total overlap between the Chelsea shortlist and the Tottenham shortlist, and yet Chelsea are going to end up with a manager far quicker than Spurs. It's completely damning of the lack of strategy, the lack of direction at the top of Tottenham, that Chelsea are going to end up with a manager before Spurs.
Adam?
To be fair, I mean, just to give, I suppose, some balance, that it's better to end up with the person that's right for you than just, you know, let's get someone in because it's all a bit frantic. And there might also be something in, let's get a manager in once we actually know where we're going to be next season. Because at the moment, Tottenham don't know if there'll be Champions League, Europa League, Conference League, only the Premier League, which might be where they might end up 8th or 9th, the way they're going at the moment. And I think there is a danger at the moment, if you were to get in a Nagelsmann who thinks he's going into the Europa League, and then all of a sudden in 4 weeks' time he's not in any European competition whatsoever, then there is this kind of expectation gap between a manager and a board and a club that they've had with Conte and Mourinho already. So I don't think it's the worst thing, you know, if Spurs were to actually just let the dust of this season settle. I'm not saying, you know, wait till mid-July, or June, July, like it was when they got Nuno in that time. But I do think there is some sense in just, let's see where we are, let's see where the budgets are going to be before we start promising managers things that we're simply not able to live up to.